Watchers in the Fourth Dimension.
Citizen Cordo, you complain too much. Make the company all warm and fed.
Because you're mad, Fendel.
It's time for the spawning.
Hello and welcome back to Watchers in the Fourth Dimension. I'm Anthony.
I'm Julie.
And I'm Riley.
And this episode, we're heading into our Season 15 retrospective, where we will look back at the season we've just finished with our usual blend of award-style categories, a recap of our metrics, and then we'll wrap up with some questions from our followers on social media. But before we get into that, I'm going to take a quick look at the mail. The mail this episode relates to our episode on the Sunmakers, and we will start with Adam Wright, who chimes in with, "Praise the company! This is my favorite of the season. I work in taxes, so it's fun to see it exaggerated. I love a good old greedy just to be greedy story. Gatherer Hade and the Collector are just funny to me. 9 out of 10 raspberry leaves." Keith Burton takes a slightly less effusive stance, saying, "As someone who, as a child, lived through this period of economic turbulence, I always ask someone new to Classic Who to give seasons 15, 16, and 17 some leeway. 3-day working weeks, wildcat strikes, and rampaging inflation means that everyone is short of money, including the BBC. But regardless of some cost-cutting across these 3 years, there are some absolute gems among the Graham Williams era. This is not one of them." Nick Rutherford takes things back in a slightly more favourable direction, stating, "I'm surprised how much you disliked this one. You know it's Louise Jameson's favourite story, and my second favourite of the season. I also thought Julie might have something to say regarding the Doctor saying, 'Why do these girls never listen to me?' when Leela gets knocked out while he's breaking into the safe."
I mean, he does this all the time, so there's no point of calling it out because he's still a dick.
P.S. I believe the Collector's eyebrows were based on the then UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Dennis Healey.
Really? Okay,
All right.
then. I have to look him up.
Our friend Mark Dunstan wrote in to say, "Your funniest podcast yet. K9 always shoots men in the nuts. Okay story, but horrible costumes and sets. At least Henry Wolfe got flushed down in his commode in the end. For a children's show, this one has a lot of violence. 9 commodes out of 10. Leela's still the best. Any chance of Watchers in the 7th dimension?" And I feel like we've been through this before, Mark. Much as we would dearly love to do a Blake 7 spin-off, which, by the way, would definitely be called Watchers in the Terran Federation, abbreviated to WTF, we barely have the time to make this show, let alone do a spin-off right now. So if we can free some things up, maybe, but don't hold your breath. Next up, we have Kieran James Evans, who says, "Cheap it may be, thanks to Hinchcliffe's overspend and the high inflation of the era, but you know what? I found it fun when I rewatched it the other month along with Face of Evil, and that's all that really matters. Yes, it is quite Blake 7-like, almost like it was Terry Nation writing, but as I like that show, it doesn't really matter to me. Pennant Roberts might not be the greatest director, but at least he's willing to cast women in a range of roles. So it gets 7 out of 10, praise to the company."
That's absolutely true. If you have fun with it, there's nothing wrong with that, and that's fine. I'm guilty of it too. I love the Web Planet, and I love the Sensorites. I've had a lot of fun with those. Not everyone agrees with me on that, but hey, you know, we have our own little pet ones, so there you are.
We do. Tony Monticello said, "My feelings on this story are mixed. On the one hand, I agree that the anti-taxation theme is overblown and even silly, but on the other, I find it intriguing that it's paired with an anti-corporatism message. On this side of the pond, anyway, one would expect a tax is a bad story to be leveled at the government rather than at crony capitalism. I'm far more sympathetic to the latter message, which makes for a strange combination. That said, we're still in childhood nostalgia mode, so my blinders are firmly in place. The worst I can give it is 7 porta potties out of 10. By the way, am I the only one who picked up Axl Rose Welcome to the Jungle vibes when Leela was straight jacketed? In all honesty, Tony, I try not to think about Axl Rose. I'm not a fan. Next up, we have Mike Muncher, who said, "Perhaps the ritual tossing of the Gatherer isn't gritty and realistic, so much a case of WWNPDD. What would Monty Python do?"
Oh.
Nice.
That said, I've always had a soft spot for how quirky this one is. I enjoy the dialogue, the preponderance for positively perfect percent of pompousness.
Oh.
and the almost Willy Wonka wall of weirdness of the most mundane of things. I'd give it 6 women's purses used as hats. All right.
Okay.
Our good friend J.M. Casey said, I haven't watched this one in over 10 years, but it's a story I've always had fun with. The premise is certainly one we've seen before, and though comparisons to Blake Seven are on point, this definitely lacks the nuanced characters and tension that show has. It's not subtle at all. You are all certainly right about that. But the dialogue and characters are a great time in my opinion. I appreciate the weird and violent touches too. Bits of this are incredibly funny, and I even like the Gatherer's annoying nasal vocal tones.
Wow.
A race of aliens called the Usurians is really weird, far too on the nose, but still kind of makes me laugh. Hail the revolution, I guess? Next, over on Instagram, the 12th Rising said, it's not the best of stories, but it's not the worst either. If you treat it as a skit on the UK tax system of the late 70s, then it's a fun watch, and Leela getting involved in the rebellion is excellent. Louise Jameson said that this was her favourite story that she was in. What you can see is Doctor Who moving firmly away from the gothic horror of the past 3.5 seasons to stories with a big idea with a more humorous stance. Plus, unfortunately, with the budget running out already, the sets aren't as good or as expensive as they could be, but with a near 40% budget cut in season 15 compared to 14 due to inflation and a 20% budget cut imposed due to overspending in season 14, it's not surprising. Our beautiful friend, Austin D. Patterson, said, the Jelly Babies fight reminded me of this dream I had a month ago about you guys, where they found the rest of the space pirates and you guys had to review it again, much to your dismay. In my dream, I made a cup of tea and started the episode, and it started with Julie and Riley complaining about how much tea there is in Doctor Who, which pissed off Anthony and myself. Anthony, I've had Jelly Babies, and I love them. I'm forever Team Jelly Baby.
I find it interesting that we have fans that are dreaming about us now.
Yeah.
I think it's because they listen to us because we help them go to sleep.
Yes, I think that's probably it. Anyway, Austin apparently leads a line of numerous Jelly Baby themed comments. As next we have R.L. Gray, who says, tragically, the rift between myself and watchers widens with this episode, which is another one of my favorites. I love the satire and the dialogue, especially between Gatherer Haid and the Collector. The meeting of Haid and the Doctor is, as Anthony noted, pure gold. Not mentioned enough is how this story is as much a satire of intensive capitalism as of unfair taxation. Go look up company stores and you'll see what I mean. On that note, of course it looks cheap. They basically live in and work for a combination of Walmart and the DMV. I give this one 8 out of 10 artificial suns. Also, I love Jelly Babies, especially the blackcurrant ones.
I still have no comment. I have not had them.
I think that's a bonus episode on the way. Julie tries Jelly Baby.
Maybe we'll do something for YouTube.
Oh, boy.
Next, we have Alex Kafajoglu, who says, I'm a little worried for the watchers for the rest of the season. Horror of Fang Rock seems to be generally considered an all-time classic, and you didn't like it. Possibly the next most popular in this season is Image of the Fendal, and you didn't like that either. Then it's probably the Sunmakers, and you're not fans. Now you're left with Underworld and the Invasion of Time. Good luck. Oh, and I like Jelly Babies, but I don't like Licorice All Sorts, and Tom Baker's Jelly Babies are sometimes Licorice All Sorts.
Huh.
Well, Alex, we are firmly in our controversial era right now, and if you've listened to our last 2 episodes, which have yet to go out at the time of recording, you'll have heard that we actually quite liked Underworld and the Invasion of Time, so there's clearly something very, very wrong with us.
And I wouldn't say we disliked Horror of Fang Rock. I think we just didn't like it as much as everyone else does. We did like it.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that as we get through this. And last but not least, a short but sweet comment from Beardo Beatnik, who wraps us up with, Riley is correct, Jelly Babies are gross. As for the Sunmakers, I really like it. 7 out of 10 canines shooting people in the dick.
Yes.
So definitely some mixed opinions here, but as always, thank you to everyone who wrote into us. As a reminder, we really do love getting your feedback, thoughts, comments, and questions. And as you've just heard, we do try to read out as many as possible on the show. So please do get in touch. As always, you can contact us through Facebook, Instagram, and the platform formerly known as Twitter at Watchers4D, or you can email us at watchers4d@gmail.com. Additionally, we would absolutely love it if you're not already subscribed to this podcast, if you went ahead and did that. And we'd also love it if you dropped us a review or rating on your favorite podcasting app. Now, let's dive right into our season retrospective, and we'll start with our end of season awards. As usual, we will answer in reverse alphabetical order, starting with Riley, then Julie, and finally myself. And so with that, we are going to start with our awards for best and worst stories. And the nominations are Horror of Fang Rock, The Invisible Enemy, Image of the Fendal, The Sunmakers, Underworld, and The Invasion of Time. Over to you, Riley.
So my options are being stuck with a bunch of annoying rich assholes, a horny prawn, incomprehensible skull metaphysics, taxes, a dumb oracle, or the Vardens.
Yes.
As you can tell by my descriptions, this season does feel like a bit of a step down from the previous, but I'm going to go with the dumb oracle. It's Underworld. Why? It's bizarre, but with a basic plot it can anchor itself onto, unlike Fendal. I really like the supporting character Herrick, unlike the supporting characters in Fang Rock. It is quick and to the point, unlike Invasion of Time, and it doesn't have sex shrimp or an obsession with taxes. So that's why I'm going with Underworld. Now, for worst story, speaking of taxes, I have not felt as sure of my pick for worst story in a long, long time. And of course, it's The Sunmakers. I'm not going to beat a dead horse here, but I will say that when you look objectively at a film or TV show and it appears so clearly that the sole purpose of its creation was to allow the writer to whine about something and the quality of the storytelling is placed as a lower priority, it just doesn't sit well with me. So where's the art? Where's the subtlety? If you want to make a point about the British tax system, go make a documentary about it. Don't weigh down the narrative, especially with something like Doctor Who, where we have a wonderful history, a wonderful background of interesting characters. We could do anything. Instead, we're going to have complaints about taxes.
Julie, what have you got?
Wow, I'm not going to be as animated as Riley apparently is. Best story is Underworld. Again, we love to be controversial here. Sorry, not sorry. But as Riley mentioned, it was just executed well. It's a simple story, but done really, really well. And I just had a lot of fun. My worst story, which believe me, I don't even remember what all my ratings were this season. But looking back, I really disliked The Invisible Enemy. And primarily because of the treatment of Leela in that story. And then, horny prawns.
Yeah, and honestly, Julie, I'm on the exact same page as you. Underworld, and I think we've mentioned this before on the show, in both Doctor Who magazine's Mighty 200 and 50th anniversary polls, it came in the bottom 5 stories of all time.
That is crazy.
And yet, for me, I'm with my friends here. For me, it's the best of the season. I think people look at the CSO that makes up a good 50% of this story and just look at that and miss all of the other great stuff that goes on in it. And yes, the execution scene was a little unnecessarily elaborate. That's a dumb way to execute someone. But when I'm looking at that for things to find wrong with the story, that's nitpicking. Mm-hmm. So I feel fully justified in naming it as my favorite story of the season. As for least favorite, Invisible Enemy, I'm with you. Bad effects, bad costumes, everything looks a little Blake 7-y. There's a reason that director was never hired back. So I'm going with The Invisible Enemy as my least favorite story of the season. Okay, next up, we have best moment and worst moment. And in this, while for a few seasons we were trying to nominate things as we went along, we've kind of fallen off of that. So you can pick anything from the season. Riley, over to you.
My best moment is everyone in Fang Rock being dead at the end. I'm kidding. Wow. But I feel like a lot of our listeners would agree with me on that. They seem to really enjoy everyone being dead at the end of that story. But I'm not going to pick that. I picked something because it was so bittersweet, as I knew her time was coming to a close. But I'm going to pick Leela's childlike glee that she had when she combined two of her most favorite things, successively hitting a target with a knife and killing someone.
Are you specifically talking about the Sontaran?
Yes, in Invasion of Time. Worst moment would be the weird dancing that the Doctor and Leela do as they were injected with the liquid into the Doctor's body in The Invisible Enemy. I understand the constraints. I have been kind of thinking how else I would do that, but I'm not a television director. But I do know that there had to have been a better way to depict that. And it just looked incredibly goofy. in a serial that was already goofy enough.
Yeah, I'm with you. Julie, what have you got for these two?
You know me, I generally have a little bit more than one response.
Of course.
Main best moment is when Herrick steals the communicator and acts like a little shit when people try to contact Klimt. Wonderful. Love it. And then the runner-up is pretty much any time K9 shot someone in the dick. It's wonderful.
That seems very on brand for you, Julie.
This is starting to build. I feel like there's going to be, if it wasn't for copyright, a Watchers t-shirt that just says that with K9 shooting someone and a man like crumpled with his arms crossed across his crotch.
It will be amazing. And worst moment is when I realized they were going to Susan Leela when she grabbed Andred's hand. Yes. Or the many times the villain was revealed and I was disappointed. The Rutans, the Fendaline, the Vardens, just bad.
Fair enough. Well, my best moment, and someone mentioned in our mail about there being a Monty Python element to the Sunmakers. And here I'm going for the execution of Gatherer Hade by being thrown off of a fucking building. I'm thinking in The Life of Brian, the stoning scene, and then you see a group of them hauling an enormous rock and just putting it down on him. It's almost like that in its ridiculousness, and I kind of love it. My worst moment is really the entirety of the end of the Invasion of Time. Everything from the revelation that the Doctor forgot everything, through to Leela staying behind because of this love story with Andred. I know Louise Jameson in the chat who played Andred really tried to put something in there to make it seem like it was out of nowhere, and I appreciate that they tried, but from a scripting perspective, it was out of nowhere, and it doesn't quite work, and Leela got done dirty. And then you have Tom Baker wheeling out the new K9 and breaking the fourth wall again. As an end to a story, it just sucks. So that's what I'm going with. Which leads us on to our next category, Best Lead Actor, and we have 3 nominations this season. We have, of course, Tom Baker as the Fourth Doctor, for the last time, Louise Jameson as Leela, and introducing John Leeson as K9. Riley, I know exactly what you're picking.
Yeah, no surprises here. It's Louise Jameson. I really fell in love with the character of Leela, and I'm going to miss her a lot. She did a wonderful job throughout. I know we've discussed the tensions behind the scenes. She had to go for so long to not have to wear those contacts, and they finally switched up for this season. She put in a lot of effort and had to deal with a lot of shit, and she did it, and it looked effortless from her. So that's a testament to her. And as you already mentioned, it's just a shame that the character did not get a better ending.
Julie, are you picking anyone other than Louise Jameson?
Of course I'm picking Louise Jameson.
There we
She
go.
was the most consistent of all the characters. Tom Baker was all over the place. We had Scooby-Doo Tom Baker, and then we had Dick Tom Baker, and then we had Breaking Fourth Wall Tom Baker, and then we had just, I don't know what he was doing. And while I love K9, there's only so much acting you can do as a robot dog.
Yeah, I agree. I think Louise Jameson brought consistency to the season. The joy and glee that she gives Leela is just brilliant. And I'm sad to see her leave. And Julie, I agree with you. Tom Baker was very inconsistent this season, and you can tell they're starting to lose control of him. So it's Louise for me as well. Next up, we have Best and Worst Supporting Actor. And this can be anyone who is not one of our 3 leads. And Riley, I'll let you kick us off here.
Well, I already mentioned him, so it won't be a surprise. I select Alan Lake as Herrick from Underworld. It's just a well-written character, but it does take a lot of acting chops to be able to handle it, because he goes from hatred/suspicion at the beginning to being kind of cavalier to then being a sacrificial hero and then showing bravery while being interrogated, all doing that while also still having that high energy characteristic that the character had throughout the entire way. And you could see him go switch from one mode to another, but still seeming like the same person. It's just very well done. For worst supporting actor, I'm going to say blank, expressionless, barely standing still on their marks. These are just some of the criticisms I have for my pick of worst supporting actor, Leaky the dog. I'm kidding.
How dare you?
I will say that there are a good amount of characters I disliked this season, but that isn't the criteria, right? This is a bad performance or bad acting, not a character that you despise. So I am looking for someone that really was blank and expressionless. And unlike Leaky, they were unmemorable. And that would be 3 people, Stan McGowan, Tom Kelly, and Julian Hudson as the Vardens. If you put a gun to my head and come up with any description of their character, I would be in a lot of danger.
Fair.
All right, Julie, let's hear yours.
Okay, best supporting. Because I don't want to repeat Riley, because yes, Alan Lake was also my favorite, I'll talk more about my runner-up, who was Colin Douglas as Reuben in Horror of Fang Rock. He just did such a good job of being a crotchety old man who had worked too long out in a lighthouse. He 100% captured that. But then when he got possessed, he did a very, very good job of being possessed. I really enjoyed his character. He was probably my favorite of everyone in Horror of Fang Rock. And then I had another runner-up, because you know me, which was John Arnett as Barusa.
Oh, yeah, good one.
And then as for worst supporting actor, I'm probably going to go with Derek Deadman as Stor, because the Suntarans were just, in general, not good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with that. I'm not going to mention them at all in these awards. They're just going to get overlooked by me. My best supporting actor in this is Milton Johns as Castellan Kellner in The Invasion of Time, because I want to punch that little shit so badly. And the fact that he was able to bring someone that sniveling, someone who would change sides at the drop of a hat, and yet he did that so well, and kudos to him. I thought he did a really, really great job in that role. My worst supporting actor on this is Annette Woolett as Adelaide in Horror of Fang Rock.
Ooh, she was my runner-up.
Because, good God, she was annoying. Talk about stereotypically hysterical woman. Just fuck off. She didn't have to play it that way. And the director of that story was a woman. So,
Yep.
I'm not going to blame Paddy Russell for that. Okay, our next category is Best and Worst Villains. And as a roundup for who we have the Rutan from Horror of Fang Rock. Man, I'm not going to do this as well as Riley, am I? The Nucleus of the Swarm, otherwise known as the Horny Prawn, from The Invisible Enemy. The Fendal Core from Image of the Fendal. The Collector and/or Gatherer Hade from the Sunmakers. The Oracle from Underworld. And the Vardens and/or the Sontarans from The Invasion of Time. Riley, what have you got?
Best villain for me is the Fendal Core, because out of that entire list, it's the only one that gave me a little bit of the creeps. Now, Benedict Cumberbatch's mom may have been doing modern dance, but she looked disturbing and it indeed feel very creepy. So I'm going with that. For worst villain, I am picking the Collector. And I know I just did my bit about the Vardens being the worst supporting actors, but at least the Vardens weren't just meant to be a lame joke character to insult tax workers. I am hoping to not have to talk about the Sunmakers anymore, but those are my 2 picks.
Nice. Julie.
It's funny because my best villain is Riley's worst villain.
Ooh,
oh, no
controversy.
way.
I know. And really the main reason is, well, one, I'm just surprised that the Horny Prawn didn't make the best or worst of this season. But honestly, the Collector and the Gatherer make the most sense as villains, because it's something that 100% would happen. And really it comes down to, I love the Gatherer. I love him. His vocabulary and delivery is just impeccable and looked a little bit like Dan Aykroyd. It's fine. Now, worst villain is the Vardens. I mean, there's really no comparison. They barely do anything. They hide in non-corporeal form when convenient and are just easily defeated. It's so bad. But then the Rutan made a runner-up because they were just poorly realized, and they didn't really seem to have a good reason to be there.
Fair.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm with Riley on best. It's the Fendal Core. I even had in my notes, so creepy. So that's the exact reason. She is brilliantly creepy. The way Wanda Ventham moved around, just not really paying any attention to anyone else, just doing her thing. completely ignoring everyone else was, to me, actually quite scary. The worst villain, you know what's coming from me.
Oh, yeah.
It's the horny prawn.
Yay!
Oy. Really, guys? Really? Couldn't make it look better? You couldn't make it less horny? I don't know. Just worst story of the season and the worst villain for me.
Nothing more intimidating than a villain that can only get to you if someone can draw a wagon to you with them in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or a wheelbarrow.
Moving on, we are going to give our award for Best Director a new name. I made an executive decision. So we now have the Dougie Camfield Award for Best Director, since we've seen his last work, and the Richard Martin Award for Worst Director. And the nominations are Paddy Russell for Horror of Fang Rock, Derek Goodwin for The Invisible Enemy, George Spenton Foster for Image of the Fendal, Pennant Roberts for The Sunmakers, Norman Stewart for Underworld, and Gerald Blake for The Invasion of Time. Riley, over to you.
Best director for me is Paddy Russell for Fang Rock, and I may not have liked Fang Rock as much as the majority of Hood'em does. I did like it. Please stop. Please stop harassing me. But I certainly was very impressed by the look and atmosphere of Fang Rock, even if that atmosphere was a foghorn going off every 20 seconds. But it does really look like the best out of the bunch. Just visually striking, good atmosphere. That's why it's Paddy Russell for me. Now, for worst director, I'm selecting Derek Goodwin for The Invisible Enemy. Now, we have already heard through the mail and discussed it before about budgetary issues, and I know it was particularly rough in this time period, but I feel like that's something to some extent that every Who director has to face. And a lot of things fell flat in this one. It is a silly story, but the look of the infected could have been better, as well as how that infection was transferred or how it looked when it was transferred. Also, the shots inside the doctor's head, as well as that poor man trapped in a black trash bag, just did not look good. So, and I haven't even touched on the prawn, which I know the prawn would like me to touch, but I won't.
Oh, no.
Nice. All right, Julie, what have you got?
All right. The Dougie obviously has to go to Paddy Russell. It has to. Again, not my favorite, but when it comes to atmosphere, Paddy does a very, very good job. And she did a really good job with that really close lighthouse setting. I know she hated the staircase, but she did a very good job. And there were also some really good close-up shots. The only downfall was the routine, but I don't necessarily blame her for that. And it's not quite the Dickie, but I'll go with the Richard Martin Award. I figured that The Invisible Enemy was going to get enough of a knockdown. So I am going to go with Pennant Roberts for The Sunmakers. I really did not like the model work for the facility. Some of it just kind of looked cheap to me. And there was nothing striking about any of the direction. It just seemed like it was some dude did his bare minimum because he was going to get paid.
Well, Riley and I are again on the same page here. Best is clearly Paddy Russell. I think from what I've read, there was a tension on that set. Apparently, she and Tom Baker fell out, and that led to that moody performance from Tom, which just kind of lent itself to the whole atmosphere. So I don't know if that was deliberate or not, but it did the trick. And to, as Riley said, just shooting in close confines, building the atmosphere of the set. It's very doom-laden the whole way through, and it really works. The Dickie, and unlike Julie's, it's not a semi-Dickie, it's a full Dickie, goes to, again, Derek Goodwin for The Invisible Enemy. I wish I had more to say than what Riley said, but Riley said it all. So that's the nice thing about going last.
And remember, if your Dickie lasts for more than 3 hours, please speak to a medical professional.
Okay, next up, the Don Smith Award for Unnecessary Fan Wank. Riley, what have you got?
Oh, well, you know that it has to be something from The Invasion of Time, right? So I'm going to select the fact that every item at Gallifrey being of Rassilon.
Oh, God damn it.
I was greatly disappointed that amongst all the items given to the newly elected president, there wasn't the loose change of Rassilon, or we don't know what this old key unlocks of Rassilon, but nope, that is my pick.
I mean, there was nothing else to pick.
Yeah. I'm just going to say we're all agreed on that.
Yes.
And last but not least, the best use of music and the worst use of music. And the nominees are Dudley Simpson. Over to you, Riley.
Well, for best use of music, I'm going to go with Dudley Simpson. And first off, joking aside, I thought the music was particularly good this season. And I feel like I hadn't really noticed it for a couple seasons, but this season I did notice it. And the best use of music for me was the procession for the coronation and the invasion of time. I really liked that. And just to annoy Anthony, I'm also going to say the slow falling theme from Underworld was a close second.
Get out of here. Get out of here.
Worst use of music goes to Dudley Simpson. And that would be for his strange return to synth that he had in Underworld with the fumigation sucking scene. Now, it is apt that would be used for a scene about sucking. And that is all I will say.
Oh, dear.
All right, Julie.
Best use of music. I think in general, I really enjoyed the music in Image of the Fendal. There was the guy running through the forest, which we unfortunately don't remember much about him, but the music was good. Some other organ stuff that happened when they're down in the basement. And then also the music for Mother Tyler was delightful. And then one runner-up is when Leela's picking out outfits in the Invasion of Time, when she rejected all of her outfits. That was also wonderful. And then worst use of music. I generally remember disliking the music from the Horror of Fangrock. I don't necessarily have a specific moment that I really hated, but I remember just having some notes of, I'm very concerned right now. Sorry, that's all I have, guys.
Well, best use of music, once again, I'm with Riley. It's the inauguration scenes in the Invasion of Time. All that organ was fantastic. However, on worst use of music, I'm not with Riley. Because my worst use of music was that dumb anti-gravity scene in Underworld with that annoying little jingle that didn't quite fit, and I'm still mad at Riley for insisting that is good.
Anthony just doesn't like fun.
Apparently not. Next, we are going to head into our stats and our metrics, and we actually had a question about this from Astrazon Danglebert Zebulon, who said, to the delight of no one but Anthony and myself, could we get some bonus obscure metrics about this season?
Oh.
Unfortunately, I don't have anything prepared that goes above and beyond my usual. So, in terms of the metrics, we increased the camp count by a total of 10 this season. This season was less camp than the previous 2 seasons. So that says something. Season 14 had a camp count of 13, and season 13 had a camp count of 14.5. But that brings our total series count for the show so far up to 165.5. So we're at about 11-ish, give or take, per season. It's not too bad. I'll explain later. Nothing. Query. We had 1 quarry, bringing our total number of quarries in the show so far up to 25.
Wow.
Now, where this season really excelled was in the jelly baby count. Because we had a couple of instances of full bags of jelly babies. And so we started the season with a total series count up to the end of season 14 of 12 jelly babies. We counted approximately 30 jelly babies over the course of the season, over double the entire show up to this time, which gives us a series count of jelly babies of 42. So there you go.
Perfect. We should see no more jelly babies. Keep it at 42.
Taking a quick look back at our scores, suffice to say, Underworld was the most popular story of the season. That got an average of 7.83, followed by Invasion of Time, 6.67. Fang Rock was not far behind it at 6.5. And then we had quite a drop. The Sunmakers came in 4.33, Fendal 4.17, an Invisible Enemy 3.5. And I think for the most part, we were all aligned. Every single one of us had Underworld as our highest scoring story. I gave it 7.5, as did Julie. Riley, you were at 8.5. You gave the highest score for anything of the season. Following on from Underworld, I gave Fang Rock a 7, Sunmaker 6.5, Invasion of Time 6.5, Fendal 5, Invisible Enemy 3. So I rounded out the season with an average of 5.92. Julie, after Underworld, Invasion of Time a 6, Horror of Fang Rock a 5.5, Sunmakers a 4, Fendal, 3.5. Invisible Enemy, 2.5. You had a season 15 average of 4.83, which was the lowest out of all of us.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. That was pretty harsh.
Riley, after Underworld, Invasion of Time, 7.5. Horror of Fang Rock, a 7. Invisible Enemy, 5. Fendal, 4. And Sunmakers, 2.5, which gives you a season total of 5.75. So I somehow managed to score it the highest. In terms of how this goes with all the other seasons we have done so far, this is our lowest rated season by quite a long way.
Whoa.
The next lowest was season 6, which we had a 6.17 on average for. This was a 5.5. So this fell quite a long way in comparison. And to put that into the full context, season 14, the one immediately before this, was our highest scored season to date at 7.78.
Yep.
So there's been quite a drop in quality for us this season. One further thing, since Beardo asked for some extras. Last time round, we drew attention to our top 10 and how many Tom Baker stories so far had infiltrated our top 10 stories. I want to focus on our bottom 10.
Oh.
And we've done some revisitations. So for those, we do have slightly more stories than Doctor Who would normally have if we were counting them in a linear way. So coming in at 92nd was the Censorites, 4.25.
It's a crime. It's a crime.
It's fine. One more story that gets less than that, and that's out of the bottom 10. It'll be fine. Coming in at 93rd, Image of the Fendal, breaking in with a 4.17. As followed by The Massacre, 4.13 in 94th. 95th, The Monster of Peladon, 4. Galaxy 4 coming in at 96 with 3.88. The Invisible Enemy, 97th, 3.5. In 98th equal, we have The Smugglers and Revenge of the Cybermen with 3.25. And I am a little astonished that Revenge of the Cybermen scored as low as The Smugglers.
Yeah.
Coming in at 100th, The Dominators, 2.38. And in solid last place, everyone's least favorite, The Space Pirates, 1.5.
Oh, yeah.
And yes, Austin is right. If it gets recovered, we will be rewatching it to see if it really was that bad.
Oh, please, no.
Interestingly, 2 out of the 6 stories from this season broke in to our bottom 10. That's quite bad. Moving on to some questions from social media. And we have effectively 3 categories here. So we will start on the more general questions from season 15. And we'll start with Joseph Staub, who asks, in what is viewed largely as a transition season from the gothic horror of the Hinchcliffe Holmes era to the more traditional sci-fi that dominated the Graham Williams and early J&T eras, this season seems to be a jack of all trades, but master of none. Does this impact your enjoyment of the season? Do you miss the more consistent vision of seasons 12 through 14, or do you think that the variety of season 15 is a nice change of pace?
I have a question, Anthony, real quick. I'm trying to remember from something we recorded at the very beginning. Didn't Williams have an idea for having a story that lasted the entire season, but they couldn't do it?
Yes.
So I think they went in an opposite direction and decided to make it as disjointed as possible. And that was a problem. But really, I think the big thing is that so many of these had the potential to be really good. But I think the suffering from bad edits to scripts and then not enough money for the effects, I think those really hurt this season. And I just don't think, since he wasn't able to realize what he wanted to do, that since he didn't have an idea, it just kind of got scattered to the wind.
Yeah, I think I'm with you, Julie. I think this one really suffers from half of it being handled by Holmes and half of it being handled by Anthony Reid. Holmes was already pretty checked out, and then Anthony Reid was getting used to the job. And that just led to a really rough season from a script's perspective. I think the fact that we generally struggled to say much that's positive about most of the villains says it all. Riley's little snide rundown of them at the beginning really spoke volumes to that. So yeah, I definitely missed the consistent vision, and it absolutely did impact my enjoyment of the season.
I don't think there's anything else I can add that wasn't said by both of you. I agree. It was, as we, I think, alluded to in previous episodes, it felt like a step down. it's a disjointed season and maybe just trying to find footing. And I think that's what it is. And I'm hopeful. There's only one way we can go, and that's up, right?
Yep.
Right?
Next up, Adam Wright. Here we are, 4 seasons into Tom Baker's run. This after the first ever Doctor Who convention on the 6th of August 1977. This entire season felt like an undercooked cake. Do you feel this season suffered more from Baker's ego or the rough transition following the departure of Hinchcliffe and Holmes?
I'm going to go. I'll just say it's the rough transition. It's Tom Baker as Tom Baker, and it's been 4 seasons. So I feel like we know what he's capable of, and sure, it started getting a little out of control, but I think that's not because of the existence of his ego. I think that's because of the transition, and it was a little hard to retain control.
I agree with that. I think Hinchcliffe did a lot to keep Tom under control, and it's very clear that Graham Williams doesn't quite have the same ability with that. And so I think the transition and Tom's ego really go hand in hand with each other.
I was going to agree. I think that one, because of that vision issue we talked about, and then just that disjointedness, but then Baker's ego, not only of just wanting it to be all about him, but I also think it led to the issues with Louise Jameson and K9, because he did not like K9 just about as much as he did not like Louise Jameson. And so I think that that also led to problems.
Next up, Tony Monticello. It appears that this has been your least favourite season of Tom Baker's era so far. How does it compare and contrast to the weakest seasons of his 3 predecessors? Does Baker manage to elevate it, or does the drop-off from Hinchcliffe's run make it an even bigger disappointment?
Honestly, I feel looking back at the weakest seasons of 1, 2, and 3, it's kind of hard to say. Because as we have done this show, I look back at even things like the Space Pirates, and there's a bit of nostalgia there because we have a good time discussing it. It's different when you're in the middle of a season because you're putting in the work and the time to watch and you're taking notes. So when you're in a season that you're not enjoying, it just feels a lot worse than others. So I don't think I could accurately answer Tony's question as to how would it compare to the weakest seasons of his predecessors. Give it some time, and then maybe I might be able to answer that question. But I do think that Tom Baker does a very good job playing the Doctor. I don't think there's any time where I don't think he does a good job playing the character. I think that if there's an issue, it's definitely from the drop-off from Hinchcliffe's run. That is the issue.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think personally, when I look at our scores, we're watching everything sequentially. And so to go from season 14 with Robots of Death and Talons and The Face of Evil and those stories that we really loved into the fucking Invisible Enemy. Jesus Christ. Like, that's a rough transition to watch through. There's a drop-off in quality, and yes, we've talked about budget and we've talked about handing over from one team to another, and it feels very, very jarring.
Yes, the drop-off is, I think, the biggest thing, but I wanted to kind of pinpoint a few specific seasons, like Pertwee. One of the things we always talk about Pertwee is that there was a consistency in the stories that were written during the Pertwee era. So even in his lowest season, there were not very many bad stories. So we didn't have things like the Invisible Enemy during his time. And then with Troughton, I think really one of the big things that saves Troughton era is it had some of the worst stories. But the dynamics between the Doctor and Jamie, and then sometimes Zoe, whenever she was there, saved the worst stories. Because if nothing else, you enjoyed watching the Doctor and his companions together. But in this era, Tom Baker not getting along with Louise Jameson comes across, and it's not as fun of a dynamic because of that.
Yeah, and I'm kind of with you, Julie, although I do look back at what I personally think are the worst seasons of each Doctor. And for the first Doctor, that's probably season 1, because the show's very much still finding its footing. And sorry, Riley, but it has the Sensorites in it.
Yep.
For Troughton, season 6, because let's be honest, that's the season with the Dominators, the Crotons, and the Space Pirates. But the flip side of that is you have the Mind Robber and the Invasion and the War Games. I mean, wow. The highs really balance out the lows. You look at Pertwee, and for me, it's his final season. I think that season has 2 stories I really enjoy, being Time Warrior and Dinosaurs. One story that I'd probably say is a bit more middling, Death to the Daleks. And then wrapping up with two stories that I don't particularly like, being The Monster of Peladon and Planet of the Spiders. So it feels like there's a decrease in quality that you could almost say that Barry Letts and Terrence Dicks knew they were on their way out, and so put less effort in at the end, while also trying to do Moonbase 3 at the same time. Fucking Moonbase 3. So for me, this season, it has a consistency problem. It's a disappointment. At the end of the day, it really does come back to what we had been used to with the Hinchcliffe era, and suddenly being served this. It's like going from foie gras to shit on a plate.
Wow. Okay. All the way down to shit.
Tell them what you really think, Anthony. Next up, the Whovian gal, our friend Naomi. How do you think the show handled its transition to a more goofy and kid-friendly program? Knowing it's likely to stay in that ballpark, how do you hope the show will improve this model going forward?
I still question about how it's more kid-friendly because the death count seems to be the same.
I agree with Julie on this one. I didn't pick up any kid-friendly vibes. A lot of goofiness, but not the type of goofiness for kids. More like goofy because it just doesn't look good.
But I think they also went too far too fast. I think there was probably some middle ground that they probably could have gone to. I understand that they wanted to make it somewhat different and maybe not the gothic horror type of vibe, but you don't necessarily have to go into the wacky to get away from that.
I think the most successful element of going kid-friendly was introducing K9.
K9 is wonderful. That's fair.
Yeah.
And K9 is definitely something for the kids. A robot dog, that's every child's dream. So, yeah, I think K9 was hugely successful to go for that. In terms of going forward, I just hope for a bit more balance. I mean, I say I hope. I know what's coming next. But that's what I would want. I would want something that's a bit more balanced where, yes, it can be a little bit goofy, but equally not when you have a horny prawn and the taxman as main villains of the season.
I think one of my things is with the villains, because the villains were very weak this season. And a lot of it had to do with I didn't always understand the motives of them, or they were just bad motives. And I think that's one thing that I can do. You can have wacky villains, that's fine. I mean, the Zygons, you look at them and you're like, this is ridiculous, but they're great. So as long as they can have some sort of motive in everything, I think they can be a lot better.
Yep. Next up, Kat, otherwise known as Citrine Dragonfly, asks, what were the biggest disappointment and biggest delight of the season?
Well, I think we may have touched on this a little bit with our awards. I would say that the biggest disappointment was how Leela was written off, and the biggest delight, I'm going to go back with Herrick again. I just really was so pleased to have a character like that not go down the trope that Doctor Who has provided us of the distrustful, arrogant, or hot-headed character.
Okay, I'll at least go with what was amazing, and that was the Leela K9 pairing.
Oh, yeah.
Because they just got along so well. Leela leaned into it, and that dynamic was wonderful. Also, I think Leela secretly liked that K9 kept shooting people in the dick. Yes, I brought it up twice. You're welcome.
My biggest disappointment was the way Leela was written out. My biggest delight was Louise Jameson, who just played the whole thing with just such a sense of wonder and glee, even when Tom Baker had been a total dick to her and all she wanted to do was leave. That's my biggest delight, that she still pulled out that performance. All right, next up, Mycroft7 asks, was there a story that was a surprise to you? And I want to answer this one first.
Go ahead.
And I will say Fendal was a surprise to me because I expected it to be so much better.
Fendal was my pick too, and that's because it still surprised me to this day because I'm still learning more and more things about the plot because I don't understand it.
Mine's more of a hindsight surprise because when I actually look at the season, Horror of Fang Rock doesn't belong in the season.
Huh. You're right.
It's gothic, and I know that's because I think it was more kind of a handover, but yeah, it just feels like it could have fit in season 14 a little bit better than it does in this season.
Kieran James Evans asks, how much do you think the budget issues arising from Hinchcliffe's overspend and the high inflation of the era actually affected the show? What should they have done differently?
They should have invested in mutual funds.
They should have not paid their workers. Oh, wait. No, I think it had somewhat of an impact. However, we have seen plenty of stories that were done on the cheap that we've enjoyed. There is a way to do it. So I understand that these are things that are going on, but when you've shown to me already that you can do things with not a lot of money, then I'm not going to use that as the excuse for it being bad.
Bingo.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think with previous seasons, we're used to having one story be the cheap one. I think the problem here is we have to look at this season being the cheap one.
Yeah. But again, I like some of the cheap ones. Some of the cheap ones have been my favorite.
Yeah, what would I do differently here? I would probably have done what they were thinking about and cancelled the final story of the season and either taken that budget forward for the following season or reinvested it into Underworld so that they could have built those caves. That's probably what I would have done differently.
Or they could have at least made the last story a 4-parter instead of a 6-parter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are a number of things they could have done. I'd be most tempted to say can the invisible enemy and find another way to introduce K9, but the reality is the invisible enemy was so early in the season they hadn't quite realized the budgetary pressures they were under, so that's not really realistic. But yeah, I think cancelling one of the stories and reusing that budget to just make it look kind of less cheap would have probably been the best move. We are moving into companion territory next, and Austin D. Patterson specifically calls out Riley and says, Riley, your scores seem to be consistently the highest this season. Is Leela to blame?
I plead the fifth.
No shit. We all know.
Yep. And then Andrew Wilcox asks, with the show heading into Baker's half-hour territory, that's a Hancock's half-hour reference, would you consider Louise Jameson the anti-emetic savior of an out-of-date prawn sandwich of a season?
Wow.
I'm loving the language. What I would say is that Louise Jameson did something with a character that could have been a caricature and could have been made fun of, and she was brilliant at it and brought something to a character that just haven't seen in quite a while. I loved it. That's all I got. Sorry.
Yeah. It's hard to disagree with that. I think she was probably the best of the season. Staying on the theme, Alan Seiler. A lot gets made about the differences in the show between the Hinchcliffe and Williams leadership and the change in Tom Baker's performance under the two showrunners. But I'm curious to know if you see a change in Leela from season 14 to 15. Are there differences in her characteristics or motivations, or even just her personality traits in the two eras? What do you think of her character arc over her season and a half?
You know, I have a suspicion that in season 15, towards the end, well, maybe not towards the end, maybe it was the whole season, I think that Louise Jameson's performance of Leela seemed to be a bit more upbeat because she knew it was her last season. I just have that suspicion. And maybe that's either the character being more comfortable and showing a more playful, friendly side compared to the tough warrior and very focused character she was in the very beginning. Maybe that's it. But I do feel like there was a little bit of a joy in their performance, and she knew that her time was ending on the show.
That's fair. I had two things. One, there were slight inconsistencies between episodes where sometimes she seemed the same, sometimes she was sidelined a little bit, and then sometimes she was more scared than usual, but I'm saying slight. It wasn't major things, especially like if you compare it with Sarah Jane. Sarah Jane got dealt dirty a lot more often than Leela got dealt dirty. But I think the biggest thing was the changes of how the doctor treated Leela was very, very up and down this season. And that's bothered me more than anything else.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that, Julie, because I think in season 14, granted she was only there for half the season, but it was very clearly a I'm going to teach you things type relationship. And you still get that occasionally in this, but you also get the feeling that he's just kind of annoyed with her for a lot of it. And it's really disappointing to see it because I actually really like the idea that you have taken this character who is smart but uneducated and he's going to help her develop. And that just gets thrown away. I really don't like that. I kind of wish that they had done a bit more with that. And I think Graham Williams wanted Louise Jameson to stay on for another season. So I can't help but wonder where it might have gone if she had and how they might have continued to develop the character. And maybe they would have gone more in that direction again. Who knows? All right, next up, Keith Burton, otherwise known as Doctor Who on Target over on Instagram. asks, statement and then a question, I guess. Louise Jameson is arguably the best actor ever to take on a companion role in the classic era. Acting talent-wise, she's up there with Patrick Troughton. From studying and duplicating the movements of curious children to fiercely defending the character from poor writing and direction, she put more effort into her performance than the end product probably deserved. If you had been showrunner for this season, what kind of character arc would you have given Louise to showcase her talent? And how would you have written her departure?
Just off the top of my head, I would feel that the best arc for her would have been something that provided a very strong internal conflict. And the two things I can think of is either something happens to her to which she loses her fighting skill and she has to come to grips of providing something or feeling of self-worth outside of that. And then the second one, the other option would be her coming to face the consequences of her killing, basically, which is pretty heavy subject matter for the show. I can't help but think of the joke that we like to bring up all the time of the Austin Powers henchman who dies, that type of situation. But those are the two character arcs I could see taking place for her just off the top of my head. And how I would have written her departure, it seems pretty cliche, but I kind of feel that based on the character, I would prefer her to be happy. So I would like for her to have something like a kind of a Klingon kind of farewell where she just goes out in a blaze of glory fighting or goes off to continue a just fight for a certain civilization that she may have come across in her travels that she really, really likes to help them. It's like a freedom movement or something like that. That's what I would have gone with.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I would have written her departure for her to stay with the outsiders on Gallifrey. Maybe made them a little less competent in their survival skills so that she can stay behind and teach them how to survive as dropouts of Time Lord society. She doesn't need to go out in a blaze of glory, but she needs purpose. And marrying her off to Andred is not purpose. That's just stupid. Yeah. It's just tacked on at the end. We've got to get rid of her. Let's marry her off to this god. Please. My girl deserves better than that. In terms of a character arc, I mean, I really think it would have been a bigger thing of her trying to kind of reconcile her more savage tendencies with more modern morality, and specifically the killing part. I like what you said, Riley, about her potentially having to face the consequences of it.
I like and dislike that at the same time because I like leaning into her strengths and I don't necessarily want to be that person, but I'm just going to say that there are times in a lot of instances where violence, I wouldn't say is necessarily the answer, but there comes a point when there's not many other options that you have. And so I generally didn't mind those because she didn't do a lot of killing of innocents. And I can be a little bit more okay with that. But otherwise, I'm kind of in agreement. I think she should have stayed with the outsiders. I think that made the most sense.
Next up, Troy Hunter. And he actually asked some questions we've already answered. So Troy, this is getting shortened a little bit. Leela is such a strong presence throughout the season. Could any of the stories worked as well if Sarah Jane was still the companion?
I think so. Yeah, I don't see why not.
I think Fendal would have worked well.
For me, it's mainly two of them. I think Horror of Fang Rock or Image of the Fendal would be the two that would fit Sarah Jane the most. Leela had a lot of reliance on being a hunter and a warrior, so I don't know if that would have fit as well, but definitely those two I think would have worked.
And I could see them rewriting the Sun Makers quite significantly to get Sarah to fit. I think she would have been okay in that story. But yeah, I can't see her in Invisible Enemy or Underworld or Invasion of Time. Rob Levy. Does K9 enhance or hinder the Doctor's relationship with Leela, especially when their chemistry was really beginning to gel?
I'm sorry, but if there's an issue with that, it's Tom Baker because he used it as an excuse so he can continue to be a dick. That's my answer.
I'm in agreement. I will say then, just to technically answer the question based off of the two options of either enhance or hinder, therefore it must be hinder because K9 gets in the way. Oftentimes, I think we had a couple times this season where we felt like, and there they go. They're in the TARDIS, and then immediately Leela's on one subplot and the Doctor's on another, and they won't be together for episodes at a time. And that's not even with K9 being necessarily involved at that point yet. So
I completely agree. I have nothing more to add to that. Next, Nathan Laws. Sarah Jane is often listed as the greatest companion in the classic era, and she and the Fourth Doctor are often said to be the best Doctor-companion combo. After having seen Leela's entire run, do you believe this reputation is justified? Is Leela a better companion, and does she work better as a foil for the Fourth Doctor?
I feel like I can't answer this question because I'm too biased, so I will recuse myself. I think that stands for itself.
Yes, I prefer Leela. I will go on that boat. You're welcome, Riley. You're not alone.
Thank you.
But one, she just seemed to have a lot more fun than Sarah Jane, and also got into less trouble. Sarah Jane very often had to be saved. And it really started to get old with Sarah Jane. So it's not even necessarily, I think, the fault of the actress or anything like that. It is the writers doing that. But Leela just stands out as someone who can take care of herself a lot more, even so, than Sarah Jane could. And I love Leela for it.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I think Elizabeth Sladen did a great job with Sarah, but she was pretty poorly treated, particularly once we got into the Tom Baker era. Personally, I think she's more effective with Pertwee than she was with Baker. Having watched this now, I would agree. I prefer Leela with the Fourth Doctor, even if Tom Baker was kind of shitty at times to Louise Jameson. So, yeah, Leela and 4. Bebe. Kieran James Evans has one eye to the next companion and simply asks, Rodan as a companion?
Sure, but I don't... The whole scene in Invasion of Time where she starts flipping out about having to take care of herself and fend. She doesn't like fending. Very, very upset about fending. That might make it a problem.
They very lightly touched on all of her, I guess, not quite mechanic skills, but, you know, when she's building things and stuff like that, that's great. But yes, I think she gets herself into a scary situation. She's just going to flip out, and I would have been really annoyed really fast.
Yeah, I agree. I think if they could keep her kind of cool, calm, but still kind of intelligent and lose the hysteria, then yes. But maybe a Rodan-like companion. We'll see what comes. And lastly, Kieran James Evans again, because he asked the question in like 4 parts, so I've passed them out into different things, asked, what are you hoping the show does in season 16?
Anything that's not season 15? But yes, as Riley said in the background, better script/script editing, that.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard for me because I know exactly what's coming in season 16, and I'm looking forward to it a lot.
Oh, okay, good. Whew. Had me scared for a second.
But for me to say, what are you hoping the show does, I can't answer that because I've seen this all before and I know exactly what's coming. So that takes us to the end of our questions, and so the end of our season retrospective. It's been a rough one, guys.
But we did it. But we made it.
We made it.
Probably when we get through all of classic Doctor Who, we will probably do a classic Who retrospective and make a determination of, was this really the worst season? And maybe by then, we will be a bit more kind about this season. But as things stand right now, this one was rough. Well, we will be back next time when we kick off season 16 with the Reboss operation, which I'm really looking forward to. But until then, thank you so very much for listening, and as always, have a good one. You have been listening to Watchers in the Fourth Dimension with Riley Schreck, Julie Philippek, and myself, Anthony Williams. This episode, like an undercooked cake, was recorded on Wednesday the 27th of March 2024. If this is your first time listening into the show, all of our previous episodes are available wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can interact with us on Facebook, Instagram, and X at @Watchers4D. And you can also email us at watchers4d@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the show, please do subscribe and consider leaving us a review or rating on your favorite podcasting app. All of those things really do help the show. And always remember, while we didn't love this season, we remain optimistic that the next one will be much better.